Good evening. Tonight, we begin with extraordinary breaking developments from Russia that suggest we may be witnessing the beginning of the end of Vladimir Putin's 25-year grip on power. Picture this. Moscow is under effective lockdown, with military checkpoints established at key intersections, armed soldiers patrolling government districts, and movement of civilians severely restricted. Vladimir Putin has not been seen publicly in 11 days, missing scheduled appearances and events. State media broadcasts old footage attempting to create the illusion of normalcy, while contradicting reports emerge about his whereabouts. And most significantly, rumors of an attempted or ongoing coup circulate openly among Russian elites, military officers, and intelligence officials, despite severe penalties for discussing such matters. This is happening right now. What we are witnessing is not routine security measures or scheduled absence. It is the visible manifestation of regime instability, the moment when Putin's control apparatus shows cracks that cannot be concealed, when the machinery of authoritarian rule begins to fail publicly. When a capital city goes into lockdown, when a leader disappears from public view for extended periods, when coup rumors circulate despite severe repression, these are indicators that power is contested, that legitimacy has eroded, and that the regime faces existential threats. Think about that. For 25 years, Putin has maintained control through combination of genuine support, manufactured consent, brutal repression, and careful cultivation of the security services. But tonight, as Moscow sits under lockdown, as Putin remains invisible, as coup rumors spread, that control appears to be slipping. This is not about one man's whereabouts. It's about the stability of a nuclear-armed authoritarian state that has invaded its neighbors, threatened the West, and destabilized global security. This is where authoritarian systems reveal their fundamental fragility. History provides sobering context for understanding what happens when authoritarian leaders disappear from public view and capitals go into lockdown. These moments are extraordinarily rare but instructive because they often precede regime change, successful coups, or violent power struggles that reshape nations. The disappearance of Soviet Premier Yuri Andropov in late 1983 and early 1984 signaled the Soviet leadership's profound dysfunction and institutional decay during the final decade of the Cold War. Andropov, who had served as KGB chairman for 15 years before becoming general secretary in November 1982, suffered from severe kidney failure and other serious health problems that rendered him increasingly unable to perform his duties. He disappeared from public view for months at a time, while state-controlled media insisted unconvincingly that he was working normally from an undisclosed location and making important decisions. The Kremlin released photographs supposedly showing Andropov meeting with officials, conducting business, and leading the nation. But careful analysis by Western intelligence agencies revealed that the photos were either old images from earlier periods or completely staged productions using stand-ins. When Andropov finally died in February 1984, after serving just 15 months as leader, the succession process was chaotic and dysfunctional, with elderly and ill Konstantin Chernenko taking power despite his own serious health problems that made him barely capable of functioning as leader. The disturbing pattern of invisible, dying leaders clinging to power continued until Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in March 1985 and inadvertently triggered reforms that led to the Soviet Union's complete collapse by 1991. The lesson remains clear and relevant. When authoritarian leaders disappear from public view while state media pretends everything is normal and attempts to manufacture false evidence of their activity, it signals systemic dysfunction, loss of control, and impending crisis. The Romanian Revolution of December 1989 demonstrated with brutal clarity how quickly and completely authoritarian control can collapse once the security forces fracture and refuse to continue repressing the population. Nicolae Ceausescu had ruled Romania with brutal totalitarian efficiency for 24 years, using the feared Securitate secret police to maintain absolute control through pervasive surveillance, systematic repression, and willingness to use lethal force against any opposition. In December 1989, protests erupted in the city of Timișoara after authorities attempted to evict a popular ethnic Hungarian pastor. Ceausescu initially responded with characteristic force, ordering security forces to massacre protesters to terrorize the population into submission. But when regular army units refused orders to massacre unarmed civilians and instead began to join the revolution, his regime collapsed with stunning speed in just days. On December 21, Ceausescu attempted to give a defiant speech from the Communist Party headquarters balcony in Bucharest, expecting the usual orchestrated support from the assembled crowd. Instead, the crowd booed him, chanted anti-regime slogans, and threw objects. The live broadcast on state television captured his visible confusion, panic, and realization that he had lost control. The next day, December 22, army units definitively switched sides and began protecting protesters rather than regime targets. Ceausescu and his wife Elena fled Bucharest by helicopter in panic, but were captured within hours, subjected to a hasty military trial, and executed by firing squad on December 25. The entire collapse, from seemingly stable, entrenched dictatorship to execution of the dictator, took less than 1 week from start to finish. The lesson remains powerful. Authoritarian regimes that rely primarily on fear rather than any form of legitimacy can collapse with stunning speed once security forces defect or refuse to continue enforcing the regime's will. The attempted coup against Mikhail Gorbachev in August 1991 showed how coup attempts during times of systemic crisis can accelerate regime collapse rather than prevent it or restore stability. Hardline Soviet officials, including KGB Chairman Vladimir Kryuchkov, Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov, and other conservative members of the Communist Party leadership, alarmed by Gorbachev's radical reforms and the imminent potential dissolution of the Soviet Union, placed Gorbachev under house arrest at his vacation home in the Crimean resort of Foros and declared a state of emergency. Tanks and armored vehicles rolled into Moscow in an intimidating show of force, and the self-proclaimed State Committee on the State of Emergency claimed power and announced they were saving the Soviet Union from collapse. But the coup plotters, despite controlling the security services and military, proved remarkably incompetent, divided among themselves, and lacking clear planning or resolve. Boris Yeltsin, president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, rallied popular opposition by courageously standing on a tank outside the Russian parliament building and calling for resistance to the coup. Key military units refused to follow coup orders to storm the parliament or arrest Yeltsin, with some commanders declaring they would not fire on Russian civilians. After just 3 chaotic days, the coup completely collapsed when military units began defecting and coup leaders lost their nerve. But the damage to Soviet legitimacy was irreversible and catastrophic. Within just months, the Soviet Union dissolved completely as republics declared independence, and the Communist Party lost all authority. The lesson remains clear. Coups against leaders during times of systemic crisis often accelerate the collapse they ostensibly seek to prevent, rather than restore stability or preserve the system. These historical examples share common elements that we are seeing reflected in the current Moscow situation. First, leader invisibility, combined with state media fabrications, signals loss of control and potential succession crisis. Second, capital lockdowns indicate fear of popular uprising or military action. Third, coup rumors that circulate despite repression suggest that elites believe change is possible and potentially imminent. Fourth, once security forces begin questioning loyalty, regime collapse can accelerate rapidly. Here's what makes the current situation so significant and potentially revolutionary. The lockdown of Moscow is unprecedented in Putin's 25 years in power and represents a dramatic escalation beyond any previous security measures. Moscow has certainly experienced heightened security during major events like Victory Day celebrations or terrorist threats. but never this kind of comprehensive, sustained lockdown affecting ordinary civilian movement throughout the capital. Military checkpoints staffed by armed soldiers have been established at key intersections throughout central Moscow, particularly around government districts. Armed soldiers, not regular police officers, patrol government districts including sensitive areas immediately around the Kremlin complex, the White House government building, and key ministry facilities. Civilians report being stopped at checkpoints and questioned extensively about their destinations, their reasons for travel, and their identification. Businesses in certain districts near government facilities have been ordered to close temporarily without clear explanation. Public transportation, including the metro, is running on significantly reduced schedules, with certain stations near government areas closed entirely. This extraordinary level of security suggests a threat to the regime itself, not external terrorism or routine security concerns, and indicates that authorities fear either popular uprising or internal military action against the government. The checkpoints are manned by regular military units from the Russian army, not just internal security forces or National Guard troops that typically handle domestic security and crowd control. The presence of regular army units in Moscow streets conducting domestic security operations is deeply significant and historically unusual because the army has historically stayed carefully out of domestic politics and civil affairs. Putin has carefully and deliberately kept the military focused exclusively on external missions, including the war in Ukraine, and has relied primarily on internal security forces, the FSB, and the National Guard for domestic control and regime protection. The deployment of regular army units into Moscow for domestic security operations suggests either that internal security forces are insufficient in number or unreliable in loyalty, or that the threat is perceived to be so severe that all available military forces are needed regardless of traditional divisions of responsibility. Western intelligence agencies, including the CIA, Britain's MI6, and European services, have observed and documented substantial troop movements into Moscow over the past week using satellite surveillance and signals intelligence. Satellite imagery shows military convoys comprising hundreds of vehicles entering the city from multiple directions simultaneously, suggesting coordinated deployment rather than routine movements. Communications intercepts reveal confusion, contradictory orders, and apparent breakdowns within the military chain of command, with different units receiving conflicting instructions about their missions and objectives. Some units appear to have been deployed specifically to protect the Kremlin complex and key government buildings from potential attack or assault. Other units are stationed in positions throughout the city that could be used either to suppress popular uprising or civil unrest, or, conversely, to control, contain, or neutralize other military units whose loyalty might be questionable. The deliberately ambiguous positioning of these forces suggests profound uncertainty among Russian military leadership about which forces are loyal to whom, about what threats they actually face, and about whether they can trust their own units to follow orders. Putin's disappearance from public view has now reached 11 days and counting, far longer than any previous unexplained absence during his entire 25-year tenure in power. He missed a scheduled meeting with defense officials to discuss the war in Ukraine, an event he would normally attend without fail, given the war's centrality to his political legitimacy. He failed to appear at a military ceremony honoring veterans of the Afghanistan War, an annual event Putin has attended religiously to demonstrate his support for the military. He was conspicuously absent from a government session discussing economic policy that state media claimed he chaired via video link, but the footage was clearly recorded weeks earlier based on participants' clothing, seasonal decorations visible in the background, and discussions of events that had not yet occurred. When Russian state television aired what they insisted was recent footage of Putin working in his office at his residence, internet investigators and digital forensics experts quickly identified the footage as being from previous broadcasts from months earlier, based on computer screen reflections, document positions, and other verifiable details visible in the frame. State media attempts to explain Putin's prolonged absence have been remarkably contradictory, unconvincing, and desperate sounding. Initial reports on state television claimed he was working normally but from an undisclosed, secure location due to unspecified security concerns that authorities refused to elaborate on. Later reports suggested completely different explanations, claiming he was conducting inspections of military facilities in undisclosed locations to assess combat readiness. Still, other reports claimed he was meeting with regional governors from across Russia to discuss economic development. Yet no governors confirmed such meetings. But absolutely no credible evidence supports any of these shifting, contradictory claims. The changing explanations and obvious use of old footage, recycled to create false impression of current activity, suggests that Russian authorities either genuinely do not know where Putin actually is, or they are concealing a situation so politically sensitive and potentially explosive they cannot acknowledge it publicly without triggering further crisis. Think about that. The Russian state cannot or will not explain where their president has been for 11 days. They are reduced to airing old footage and making up stories that contradict each other. This is not how stable governments behave. This is how regimes in crisis behave when they have lost control of the narrative and possibly of the situation itself. Here's the first hook. Coup rumors are spreading openly, despite the fact that discussing coups in Russia carries severe criminal penalties. Under Russian law, merely speculating about coups or regime change can result in treason charges carrying up to 20 years imprisonment. Yet rumors circulate among Russian elites in Moscow, among military officers discussing the situation privately, among intelligence officials speaking to foreign counterparts, and even among ordinary Russians on social media, despite heavy censorship and surveillance. The fact that people are willing to discuss coups despite severe risks suggests they believe change is not just possible, but perhaps imminent or already underway. The specific rumors circulating vary in details, but share common underlying themes about power struggles and regime change. Some widely circulated rumors suggest that Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and National Guard Commander Viktor Zolotov, both powerful figures with significant forces under their command, have formed an unlikely alliance to remove Putin from power and negotiate an end to the catastrophically failing Ukraine war. Other rumors suggest that FSB Director Alexander Bortnikov, with his control over domestic intelligence and security apparatus, is leading or contemplating a security services coup to restore political stability and end the international isolation that threatens Russia's economy. Still, other rumors circulating among military officers suggest that groups of senior officers are actively planning to arrest Putin for war crimes and hand him over to international tribunals in exchange for peace negotiations. Some rumors claim Putin suffered a serious medical emergency, possibly including stroke or heart attack, and is incapacitated in a hospital or medical facility. Others claim he fled Moscow for a secure location in the Urals or Siberia when he learned of coup plotting against him through intelligence reports. Western intelligence agencies assess that while specific individual rumors circulating may be false or exaggerated, the underlying pattern of rumors and the circumstances surrounding them suggests genuine, serious instability within Russian leadership. American officials briefed on highly classified intelligence from multiple sources say there are clear and unmistakable indicators of ongoing power struggle within the Russian leadership at the highest levels. British intelligence sources indicate, through diplomatic channels, that Russian security services are badly fractured along institutional and personal loyalty lines, and that Putin's previously absolute control over the FSB and military intelligence services is no longer certain or unchallenged. German intelligence has reported increased communications between Russian military commanders and Russian officials and foreign intermediaries discussing scenarios for post-Putin Russia. These independent assessments from multiple Western intelligence services suggest that even if no formal, coordinated coup attempt has yet occurred, the conditions and preconditions for regime change clearly exist. Key actors are actively positioning themselves for potential dramatic change, and the possibility of coup or regime collapse is being taken seriously by those who would need to execute or prevent it. The timing of the crisis is particularly significant given Russia's disastrous and humiliating performance in Ukraine over nearly 3 years of brutal warfare. The war has cost Russia hundreds of thousands of casualties, including killed and wounded, enormous economic damage from comprehensive Western sanctions that have cut Russia off from global markets, complete international isolation from Western institutions, and repeated humiliating military defeats on the battlefield that contradict Putin's promises of quick victory. Putin staked his personal political legitimacy and the regime's survival on achieving military victory and restoring Russian greatness through territorial conquest. The war's catastrophic failure has systematically undermined his authority among elites who previously benefited from stability and prosperity under his rule, and among military officers who deeply resent being scapegoated and purged for strategic failures that Putin himself ordered despite their professional advice against such actions. The economic situation in Russia has deteriorated sharply and dangerously despite official government claims of stability and resilience. Western sanctions have systematically crippled key industries, including energy, technology, finance, and manufacturing, driven inflation to dangerous double-digit levels that erode living standards, and cut Russia off completely from the advanced technology and critical components needed for military production and economic modernization. Russian elites who profited enormously under Putin have lost access to billions in foreign assets frozen or seized by Western governments, face travel restrictions that prevent them from enjoying their wealth in Europe and America, and see absolutely no path back to the comfortable pre-war status quo as long as Putin remains in power and continues the war. These elites tolerated and supported Putin when he brought them stability, prosperity, and opportunities for enrichment. They are actively reconsidering that support now that he has brought catastrophic war, economic crisis, and international isolation that threatens their wealth and lifestyle. The security services themselves show unmistakable signs of institutional fragmentation and divided loyalties. Putin has always maintained power through the classic authoritarian tactic of playing security agencies against each other to prevent any single institution from becoming too powerful or unified enough to challenge his rule. But the war's disasters and systemic failures have forced these agencies to cooperate more closely than ever before out of necessity, and in cooperating, they have discovered shared institutional interests and grievances that may not align with Putin's personal interests or survival. The FSB blames the military for catastrophic battlefield failures and incompetent planning. The military blames the FSB for massive intelligence failures that left Russia unprepared for Ukrainian resistance. Both institutions increasingly blame Putin personally for the strategic miscalculation of launching an unwinnable war. This shared grievance against Putin creates a dangerous potential foundation for collective action by security services against the leader who created the crisis. Russian oligarchs, once firmly and totally controlled by Putin through a carefully calibrated combination of lucrative rewards for loyalty and credible threats of imprisonment or asset seizure for disloyalty, are showing unprecedented signs of public and private discontent. Several prominent oligarchs have spoken out obliquely but unmistakably against the war in public statements. An extraordinary and risky act given that Putin has imprisoned other oligarchs for far less. Others have quietly moved whatever remaining liquid assets they control beyond Putin's reach to jurisdictions where Russian authorities cannot seize them. Some have made discreet contact with Western government officials through intermediaries to explore what post-Putin Russia might look like, what role they might play in a transition, and whether their assets might be unfrozen in exchange for supporting regime change. These coordinated actions suggest that even Putin's most privileged supporters, the oligarchs who benefited most from his rule, are actively hedging their bets and preparing psychologically and financially for possible regime change in the near future. The public mood in Russia, while extraordinarily hard to gauge accurately given pervasive repression and state propaganda, shows unmistakable signs of deep dissatisfaction and disillusionment. Thousands of Russians have fled the country to avoid military mobilization, draining Russia of educated professionals and young people. Protest activity, while brutally suppressed by riot police and resulting in thousands of arrests, continues at low but persistent levels despite severe risks. Opinion polls, even state-controlled ones that typically produce pro-regime results, show measurable declining trust in government institutions and declining approval ratings for Putin personally. The war's massive economic costs are increasingly felt by ordinary Russians through persistent inflation, shortages of imported goods, and visibly declining living standards. While large-scale public uprising seems unlikely given the regime's willingness to use overwhelming force against protesters, the lack of genuine public enthusiasm for the regime or the war means Putin cannot count on popular mobilization to support him against elite challengers who might promise to end the war and restore prosperity. Something deeper than immediate crisis is revealed by these developments. We are witnessing the fundamental vulnerability of personalist authoritarian regimes that concentrate all power in one individual. Putin eliminated institutional checks, marginalized potential rivals, and ensured all power flows through him personally. This concentration of power was effective for maintaining control, but created catastrophic vulnerability if Putin himself becomes weakened or incapacitated. There is no legitimate succession mechanism, no institutional framework for transferring power, no clear second-in-command who could step in smoothly. This creates incentives for ambitious figures to seize power through coups rather than wait for orderly transition that will never come. The lesson is universal and applies to all personalist dictatorships. Systems that vest all power in one individual may appear strong, but are actually brittle because they lack the institutional resilience to handle leadership succession or crisis. When the central figure disappears, becomes incapacitated, or loses control, the entire system can collapse rapidly because there is no framework for orderly transfer of power. Ambitious figures see opportunity and act to seize power before rivals can. This creates chaotic power struggles that can lead to civil conflict or state collapse. Think about that carefully. Putin built a system designed to keep himself in power indefinitely. In doing so, he created a system that cannot function without him and that provides no mechanism for peaceful succession. Now, as he disappears from public view and Moscow locks down, we are seeing the consequences of that choice. Power struggles are not taking place within established institutions following clear procedures. They are taking place in shadows, with military units positioned ambiguously and coup rumors spreading because there is no other way for power to change hands in Putin's Russia. Here's the second hook. The international implications of Putin's potential fall are enormous and unpredictable. Russia possesses the world's largest nuclear arsenal. Russia is waging war in Ukraine. Russia has forces deployed in Syria, Africa, and other regions. Russian instability could lead to nuclear weapons falling under uncertain control, could escalate or end the Ukraine war depending on who takes power, and could trigger broader regional instability. Western governments are closely monitoring the situation and developing contingency plans for multiple scenarios, but the truth is that Putin's sudden fall would create uncertainty more dangerous than his continued rule in some respects. The nuclear question is particularly acute and terrifying given Russia's status as possessor of the world's largest nuclear arsenal. Russia's nuclear command and control systems are designed with multiple safeguards specifically to prevent unauthorized use by rogue commanders or accidental launch. But those carefully designed systems fundamentally assume a functioning, clear chain of command with unambiguous authority flowing from the president through military channels. During a coup or violent power struggle, that chain of command fragments completely and authority becomes violently contested among multiple claimants. while accidental or unauthorized nuclear use remains statistically unlikely even during leadership crises, the probability of catastrophic accident or unauthorized use increases measurably during periods of acute leadership instability, internal conflict, and breakdown of normal command structures. Western intelligence agencies are monitoring Russian nuclear forces with unprecedented intensity and focus for any signs of unusual activity, changes in alert status, unauthorized movements, or any breakdown in command and control that might indicate loss of centralized control over nuclear weapons. The Ukraine war could take multiple, dramatically different directions, depending entirely on who successfully replaces Putin and what faction gains control. A nationalist military coup led by hardliners might actually intensify the war effort, escalate to even more dangerous levels, including potential use of tactical nuclear weapons, and refuse any negotiated settlement. A pragmatist coup by economic and political elites who want desperately to restore profitable relations with the West and end crippling sanctions might immediately seek negotiated settlement and withdrawal from Ukraine in exchange for sanctions relief. An FSB coup focused primarily on domestic stability and regime survival might withdraw from Ukraine entirely to focus resources and attention on maintaining internal security and preventing popular uprising. Western governments are attempting urgently to establish back-channel communications with potential Russian successors through intelligence services and diplomatic intermediaries to encourage peaceful transition and responsible policies. But they frankly have extremely limited visibility into who actually holds power in Moscow right now, or who might emerge victorious from any power struggle. Moscow sits under unprecedented military lockdown tonight. Putin remains invisible, despite desperate state media efforts to pretend otherwise. Coup rumors circulate openly. Military units are positioned ambiguously. And the world watches nervously as a nuclear-armed authoritarian state teeters on the edge. The outcome remains profoundly uncertain and unpredictable. Putin may re-emerge successfully and suppress the threat. A coup may succeed decisively, or Russia may descend into prolonged and violent power struggle among competing factions. Moscow sits under lockdown tonight. Putin remains invisible despite state media efforts to pretend otherwise. Coup rumors circulate openly among people who know that discussing such matters can land them in prison. Military units are positioned ambiguously throughout the capital, and the world watches nervously as a nuclear-armed authoritarian state appears to teeter on the edge of internal collapse or violent power struggle. The outcome remains uncertain. Putin may re-emerge and successfully suppress whatever threat has prompted the lockdown. A coup may succeed in replacing him with new leadership, or Russia may descend into prolonged power struggle with competing factions fighting for control. Each scenario carries different, profound, and lasting risks and uncertain strategic opportunities. What is certain is that Putin's 25-year dominance of Russia appears more vulnerable tonight than at any point since he came to power in 2000. You can concentrate all power in yourself to maintain absolute control, but you cannot prevent the chaos and violence that results when you disappear and leave no legitimate succession mechanism. You can rule through fear and brutal force, but you cannot prevent elites from plotting actively against you when fear is outweighed by grievances and opportunities. And you can lock down a capital city and position military units throughout the streets, but you cannot control rumors or restore lost legitimacy once people believe change is possible and imminent. Moscow is under unprecedented lockdown. Putin has disappeared completely from public view. Coup rumors explode despite the severe risks of discussing them. A quarter-century of authoritarian rule appears to face its most serious and potentially existential challenge, and the world watches to see whether Putin's system can survive his absence or whether we are witnessing the beginning of the dramatic end of his long rule. I'm Maddow. Thank you for being here. Stay informed, and good night.